Well, I left my jacket on just for a little while. I'm from California. We don't wear jackets down in California very much. But I want you to see this little button up here. You see it? You know what it stands for? It stands for Creation Sabbath. You ever heard of Creation Sabbath? Creation Sabbath is a designated date throughout the Seventh-day Adventist Church to celebrate Sabbath, creation Sabbath, to celebrate creation. What's the date this time? It's always the fourth Sabbath in October. So it'll be October 26th. So if you're interested in Creation Sabbath, October 26th, maybe you can bring some ideas to the Sabbath school teachers, the pastor, church board, or whatever. You can do something special. There are videos you can show. There's guest lectures. You can have a sermon on creation, or you can have the children do things. And there's lots of things they can do for creation in the children's division. So there's lots of things you can do for that. So I just want to make a little commercial announcement. This program is brought to you by Creation Sabbath. All right. Now, this afternoon, the talk probably won't be quite as long as last night. I'm going to talk about the stars a little bit, about not stars, but about the Big Bang Theory. So be prepared for that. And I've been quite interested in, I'm not an expert on Big Bang Theory, but what I'm really interested in is the arguments people develop for design, for intelligent design. So we'll look at this from a standpoint of intelligent design. And the title I've chosen, I borrowed from a colleague, Do the Heavens Still Tell? Kind of an interesting, I think there's another switch here. Somewhere. Well, I'll turn it over here. Maybe there's something missing there. Or maybe it just isn't connected. Ah, there it goes.
It's this way.
Yeah, I was pushing that one, but...
but we're not getting it through the...
Let me see if it... No, it's still not... Oh, I see. It's not going through the feed there. Okay. Well, if you're seeing it there, then we can go with that. All right. So, David, some years ago, quite a few years ago, said the heavens declare the glory of God. Remember that text? And so he saw, yeah, and the firmament, so, okay, very good. Now we're working. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So the question is, do we still see God's glory in the heavens? And that's the question. So I want to talk about what I call the big picture. Sometimes people get all hung up on what I would call little questions. For example, what was the source of the light on the first 3 days of creation? Have you ever wondered that? We all wonder that. Now, is that really a serious, crucial question for our Christian experience? No. It's a curiosity question. We'd like to know, but we haven't been told that. There are a number of ideas. Some people prefer the idea that God's presence gave the light. And you can support that with Psalm 104 when it says, you cover yourself with light as with a garment. And so that's a satisfactory answer. Whether it's, there are other people who say other things, and that's fine. I don't know that we need to know necessarily, but it's not a question we need to agonize over. And there are some other small questions. Then there are some questions that are fairly significant that we struggle with. Sometimes, if you focus only on the things that trouble you, you will probably have a troubled existence, won't you? What we need to do occasionally is step back from the questions that bother us and say, in the overall scheme of things, what's the big story here? What does the big picture tell me? What do we know? Not focusing on what we don't know, but what do we know and what can we be confident of? I'd like to look at that. And we'll talk about the universe, then we'll talk about the earth. In the universe, we'll talk about 3 points: the origin of the universe, the order of the universe, and the fine-tuning of the universe. And we'll relate those 3 things, and I'll take off my jacket now. We'll relate those 3 things to Romans 1:20, where Paul says, you can see something about God in nature. And what he specifically, some people use this as a basis for what we call natural theology. Natural theology is the attempt to build a theology about God from nature alone. And there is a certain amount that we can learn about God from nature. But what does Paul tell us that we can see about God? If you read the text, and it's always useful to read the text, not just listen to what somebody says. Read the text. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. And then even, which is an introduction to the series, even his eternal power and Godhead. Okay? So what can we see from the things that are made? We see clearly his eternity, right? His power and his divinity, which I think we could describe as his supernatural characteristic. In other words, he's eternal, he's powerful, and he is above nature, supernatural. I think that's what the text is telling us. Now, I have wondered before, how can I see in nature that God is eternal, powerful? I can kind of see that. He's certainly brilliant. Talk about an engineer, a spectacular engineer, and supernatural. Well, it turns out that I see, at least, and I hope that I'm not too far off here, I see all of these things coming from a single theory. And it has to do with the origin of the universe. Now, does the universe have an origin? Well, the Bible says it does, doesn't it? And the text I like there is in John chapter 1. All things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. Everything that was made by God, by Jesus, in fact. So Scripture is pretty clear. Yes, it had a beginning. What does science have to say about that? Well, Aristotle thought that the universe was infinite, was static, it existed forever. If the universe has existed forever, how would you explain its origin? Well, it didn't have an origin. You see? If something existed forever, it did not have an origin. Therefore, you do not need to explain its origin. It's a given. So, if the universe existed forever, we don't need to explain it, and we can be comfortable with our materialist philosophy. That is, we don't need to have to even worry about God, because the universe doesn't need God to explain it. It's there already. And so the secular scientists were very happy with the idea of a static, universal, eternal universe. But when observations of the sky began to be made, looking at what's called the redshift, the stars farther away had different colors in their spectrum. And then somebody found that they predicted that if that were, there should be what do they call it? COBE, cosmic CMB, cosmic microwave background. It seems like there was an O in there. Maybe it's observed or something. I'm not sure. Maybe it's cosmic, CO. Maybe that's where it came from. I'm not sure. Anyway, cosmic microwave background. And they found that prediction was fulfilled. So there was this debate. Did the universe have an origin? What do you think the atheists wanted to say? No origin. No, the universe they didn't like it. Fred Hoyle was one of those, a famous astrophysicist, Fred Hoyle. And he wanted to just kind of disparage this idea of the universe having a beginning and starting out and spreading out. He said the universe didn't begin with any big bang. And he said that because he opposed the idea and he was trying to kind of disparage the whole theory. But then that's where the name Big Bang came. It actually stuck. From that time forward, it's called Big Bang Theory. Interesting that many Christians are very uncomfortable with Big Bang Theory. But the atheists are uncomfortable with it too. It's an interesting paradox there. Anyway, the Bible says there was a beginning, it was caused by God. So this is a point where science and the Bible have an agreement. That, in terms of historical science, that's not very common for the two to have an agreement. But in this case, they do agree. They agree, of course, they disagree on the mechanism, but they do agree that there was a beginning. So we have this universe with a beginning, and we want to ask, by the way, I am not endorsing the Big Bang Theory, okay? I want to make that clear. I don't endorse the Big Bang Theory. And in fact, that raises an important point that we could have said more about last night. When you have a scientific theory, what you really have is the best known explanation for what we see based on what we know now. That's how science comes to a consensus. It's the best known explanation without invoking supernatural events. In other words, if you keep, at this moment, given all that we know, if you don't put God in the equation, the Big Bang is the next best theory. So that doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's the best we know at this moment. And I'm not an authority in this area, but I understand there are some scientists who do not accept the Big Bang Theory. There are various kinds of other ideas that they have that they want to put in. They'd like to try to figure out a way to see if they couldn't explain what they see based on an eternal universe. But that's beyond my pay grade, as they say. All right, so the first question we want to ask is, what's the explanation for the origin of the universe? Now, we know that. We know the answer to that. He spoke and it was done. He commanded and it stood fast. We know the answer to that. But if you don't believe that, if you want to try to explain it mechanistically, what do you say? Well, I think I told the story last night about the astronomer who was talking about the Big Bang and the little boy. Remember that story? He says, first, let me see if I understand what you are saying here. First, there was nothing, and then it exploded. You say, wait a minute. Nothing doesn't explode. If there's nothing there, it can't explode. How do you explain something from nothing? Well, I think creation ex nihilo is the answer. But if you're a scientist and you don't want to use that answer, you just don't have an explanation. So what is the best explanation for the origin of the universe? The best explanation, if you don't restrict yourself to scientific explanations, what's the best explanation? Some supernatural cause. There isn't any natural law that says universes come into existence. So there are some, let's see if some have proposed some explanations, and one of them that really puzzles me, maybe my friend Paul can help me with this. Some have said maybe the universe emerged from a quantum fluctuation in the vacuum. But my question is, what do you mean by a vacuum? A vacuum, as I understand it, is a region of space in which matter is absent. But it's within space, isn't it? I mean, if you don't have a universe, if you don't have space, how can you have a vacuum? You have nothing. Nothing is not a vacuum. Vacuum, as far as I can see, a vacuum is not nothing. So, if you have a quantum fluctuation in the vacuum, you already have something in existence. One of the main questions in the philosophy dealing with these questions is, why is there something rather than nothing? In other words, why is there a universe? Why are there people? Why is there anything at all? Why isn't there just nothing? And I think the best answer for that is that there is a creator. Supernatural causation is the best explanation. So, that's the answer to the first question, I think. The best answer we have available is that God caused the universe to come into existence. The second question that we want to know about is, why does the universe have order? Why couldn't it just be chaos? Why do you have order? Now, you've probably heard of the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics says that in an open system, processes tend toward more disorderliness over time, basically. That means that in the universe, assuming the universe is an open system, next year, the universe will be more disorderly than it is this year, right? It means last year, the universe will be more orderly, less disorderly than it is this year. So if you go back, well, if we go forward in time, scientists predict that eventually the universe will cool down and everybody will go extinct and so on. But on the other hand, if you go backward in time, you should see order present from the beginning, even more order. That means when the universe started out, it was highly structured from the very beginning. Is that a law of nature? What causes the structure to originate? How did the universe start out so orderly that it still appears orderly today? I think really the best explanation is that there's a supernatural mind involved. There's a designer who had a purpose, who put information into the system to structure it. So the universe is orderly. A third thing we see about the universe is that it is precisely structured. And this, again, goes way beyond my pay grade, but there's one example here that I think I at least understand the basic principle for. In the nucleus of an atom, there are protons and neutrons, and in the rest of the atom, there are electrons, okay? Now, you know that protons have a positive charge, and electrons have a negative charge, right? And positive charges and negative charges attract each other, don't they? Yes. But two positive charges repel each other, right? So if we look just at the nucleus, and you have an atom, and in the nucleus you have many, let's say several protons. They are being pushed apart by the electrostatic force, pushed apart by this repulsion. Why don't they just fly apart? Because there's another force pulling them together called the strong nuclear force, right? So you have this balance between the strong nuclear force pulling them together and the electrostatic force pushing them apart. Now, if the strong force pulled them together much more than the electrostatic force pushed them apart, what would happen to the protons in the universe? They would clump together into clumps. If all the protons in the universe were clumped together, not in a single clump, I don't mean, maybe they would, I don't know. We don't have that universe, I can't predict it. But if all the protons were clumped, there would not be a single atom with one proton in it. What's the name of the atom that has one proton? Chemists? Hydrogen. Hydrogen has one proton, okay? If the strong force kept the protons together, we wouldn't have hydrogen. If we didn't have hydrogen, could we have water? No. If we didn't have water, could we have life? No. Aha. So if the strong force were too strong, we couldn't have life as we know it anyway. What if the strong force were too weak? So that the electrostatic force overpowered it and all the protons were individual. What would you have? A whole universe of nothing but hydrogen. If you had nothing but hydrogen, could you have oxygen? No. Could you have water? No. You couldn't have life. So it's only because those two forces are balanced appropriately that you can have water and you can have life. In fact, there are many physical constants. Those are the only ones I understand, partly. But there are many other physical constants that scientists have determined if they were just off by a relatively small amount, you couldn't have life in the universe. In fact, in some cases, you couldn't even have atoms. If you couldn't have atoms, how would you have life? You know, the universe, the more scientists study it, the more they see the way the universe is structured is so carefully precise. They call it fine-tuning. And they have compared it to the idea of having this headquarters, this, let's call it the celestial design lab, where you have all these dials and you're creating universes. So you have dials and you set one to the strength of the nuclear force, and one to the strength of the electrostatic force, and one to the strength of gravity, and one to the strength of the weak force, and one to the mass of the electron, and one to the charge to mass ratio of the proton, and one, all kinds of things, speed of light, etc. What are the chances, if you were the one making the universe, what are the chances that you would set each of those dials to just the right figure? The chances are appropriately called astronomically low, right? It doesn't look like the properties of our universe are plausibly explained by chance. They're too carefully set, too finely tuned. Well, what do you do if you're an atheist and you want to explain that? Well, there's a couple of options that have been tried. Let's see. Well, I don't have them here. Okay, well, all right, one of them is that it's called the multiverse. Have you ever heard of the multiverse rather than universe? Multiverse is the conjecture that there are actually an infinite number of universes, every one slightly different, so that inevitably one of them was going to have win the lottery, so to speak. One of them was going to come out just right. Maybe there's so many of that didn't work, but one that did. Now, what is the scientific evidence for more than one universe? How would you gather that evidence? Could you go outside the universe and find more? No. The idea of a multiverse is so speculative that I'm surprised it's even considered to be science. But it's become a popular theory, and you'll hear about it. Some may even say it's a scientifically valid idea, but I think, in my view, it isn't even scientific. It is an attempt to rescue atheism from the evidence. But anyway, those are three properties of the universe that I think point to intelligent design. I think reasonably and rationally point to intelligent design. All right, now I promised something that isn't in the slides yet. So we want to talk about Romans 1:26 or 1:20. God's eternity, his power, and his supernatural nature. We have learned that the universe consists of space, right? Three-dimensional space. There's a fourth dimension of the universe that we know about called time. See, time is a property of our universe. When God created the universe, he created time. Wow. I find that, I struggle to understand really what that means. But if God created time and the universe, and he, if we can say he was pre-existent, he was there. I mean, a physicist, astrophysicist, say there was no before. But I think in God's existence, there has to be a before. Before the universe, God was there to create time. So God was present before time began. That's the point. And God will continue to be present forever. What word do we use for something who was there before time began and goes on forever? Eternal, right? So just from the recognition that the universe has a beginning and the belief that God created the universe, we can see he's eternal. Romans 1:20. Now, I don't know, you probably have air museums here too, but down where I live, there's an air museum at the March Air Force, it's now March Air Reserve Base. There's some planes. One of them, there's a hangar, has a Blackbird. Do you remember the Blackbird spy plane? Fancy thing. It was supposed to be radar, stealth kind of stuff. And in that same hangar, there is something that looks about like a rocket. It is maybe about as long as this front part of the stage is, something like that. And I don't know, maybe so big around, something like that. And it's got a label there, thermonuclear bomb. Woo! Hopefully it's not actually loaded. I hope it's just the shell. But anyway, it's a nuclear bomb. Now, a nuclear bomb has an awful lot of energy in it, enough to flatten Portland, wouldn't it? Where does that energy come from? Why do we call it a nuclear bomb? Because it's taking energy from the nucleus of atoms, isn't it? The energy is coming from the nucleus of the atoms. But where did the atoms get their energy? From the Creator, right? You're with me on this? Yeah? Okay. If God created all of matter, he put the energy into the nucleus of the atoms. Okay? So, think of all the energy in that one little bomb. Okay? Now, think of all the energy in all the nuclear bombs. Quite a lot more. You know, that's a lot more than I can generate on my stationary bicycle, right? But then think about the whole planet. All the nuclei of all the atoms in our planet. A humongous amount of energy. The thermonuclear bomb would hardly be noticed in all that. But then start thinking about the universe. The stars throughout the sky. Billions and billions and billions of them. All the energy. Where did that energy come from? From the Creator. Would it be an exaggeration to say that a creator who was able to do that would be omnipotent? It doesn't seem like a stretch at all to me. An omnipotent creator who could do, now, and here we'll just make a side point, but it's an important one. If that creator has the power to to put the energy into the nuclei of the atoms of the entire universe, is there any event within the universe that is too hard for him? I mean, the answer's obvious, isn't it? a God that can create the universe has unlimited power. It's logically impossible to restrict his power within the universe when his power is so much greater than the universe that he created the whole thing. So, to me, that's a reassurance. God is powerful. I can pray to him, and he may not follow my instructions. Remember, that's one of the problems sometimes. But he's capable of doing whatever he needs to do. He is capable of doing absolutely anything that needs to be done. And he's too good to do everything I ask him to, and too wise. But he's capable of doing it. There is no language, speech nor language where their voice is not heard. This information is available to the whole scientific community. Oh, one more thing is eternal power and Godhead. Supernatural. Now we talk about that lab, that universe-creating lab where you set in the dials. God must have had a lab something like that, a mental lab, where he was planning what he would do for the universe. Because the universe obviously is not an accident. It was carefully planned and fine-tuned. So here's God deciding on what the law of gravity would be, right? On the masses of the different particles, on the speed of light, all the properties. In other words, the features of our world that we call laws of nature are actually regularities that God chose intentionally in order to create our universe. The point there is that what we call the laws of nature are not the restrictions within which God has to work. No. They are the structure he used in order to do his work. He chose that structure in order to do it. So that means that what we call nature is subservient to God. God is the ruler, the sovereign, we often say, of nature. He is above nature. The word for that is supernatural, right? So there we have, in what we see in the universe, the fulfillment, at least from my experience, the fulfillment of what Paul promised in Romans 1:20, his eternal power and Godhead. It's there just in the idea that he created the universe. And if, as many people do, you interpret Genesis 1:1 to refer to the universe, and that's not the only way to interpret it, but many people interpret it that way. If you interpret Genesis 1:1 to refer to the creation of the universe, you have it already. You don't need the rest of the Bible to make that point. You already have him creating the universe. He's eternal, powerful, and divine. Just Genesis 1:1. I was just reading recently a commentary on Genesis 1:1. I was kind of struck by the very opening part of it. It says, Genesis 1:1, it's a commentary on Genesis. It starts out with Genesis 1:1. He says, Genesis 1:1 is the most important text in the Bible. I thought, wow, that's really something I need to think about. It's amazing. But when you stop and really analyze it, the implications of Genesis 1 really are very widespread, very far-reaching. So anyway, there's the universe. Let's look next at the earth, at our environment. And we'll just look at three points: light and heat that goes with it, atmosphere and water. Paul, I have tried to find texts in which the Bible promises us that we can see something about God in nature. I have not seen very many of those texts. There is the one in Romans 1:20. That's the most famous one, I think. Another one that is in Acts 14, where Paul says, I think this was Lystra, where the people wanted to worship him for healing somebody or whatever it was. I've forgotten now. But anyway, Paul gave him a little sermon. Nevertheless, he did not leave himself without witness, and that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons. There you have something that's evidence that God is good in the rain and fruitful seasons. And the word I would use for that is providence. the provider. Because rains and fruitful seasons, if you're at all close to the soil, you know that's where food comes from. And therefore, this is God's method of providing for our survival, our food. So that means that in the provision of food, we see the goodness of God. So we see something about God there. And so if we look at our environment, we can learn something about God. Here's a text that I like to use when I talk about how the earth is designed. Isaiah 45. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it for a purpose, right? He formed it to be inhabited. That's a purpose. So there is a purpose to the formation of the earth, and a purpose means there's some design involved in establishing that purpose. So what do we need for life? If we're going to have an earth with life on it, what do we need? Well, we need a source of usable energy. We need raw materials for building cells. We need chemistry principles for energy usage and material transformation. Suitable temperature and pH range, system for distribution of heat and materials, lots of other things, but I mean those are substantial things that we need to have an earth. If you ever heard the word terraforming? If you ever watched some Star Trek episodes, there was some, I've forgotten which thing, but I used to watch Star Trek The Next Generation. This is a confession, Pastor. And one of their episodes, they actually went to another planet and they were going to terraform it. Now, I never heard that word before, but what it meant was they were going to condition the environment so that it would support life. Terraforming. And so that's the kind of the problem we're looking at here. How do you make an earth suitable for life? And here are some of the things you have to do. So we need a source of usable energy. Where does our energy come from? Sunlight, right? Sunlight. You can argue about some microbes that use chemical energy, but that's really trivial. The sun. Where does your household energy come from? Some power plant transmitted by wires. Wouldn't it have been more efficient if God had just put the sun here on the surface of the earth and it would be closer? Yes, amen. What would have been the result? We're toast, right? We're toast. See, the sun is too dangerous. God put it out in space. But I just have to look at the genius of the Creator. We get our energy through wires, right? Those wires transmit that. Electricity comes along. There's something solid connecting my light bulb with the power plant. But there's nothing solid connecting the sun to us. There's something solid, well, there's material at least, between my mouth and your ear. If we pump all the air out, could you hear me? No. You hear me because there's vibrating molecules. The sound energy requires a medium to transmit it. Electrical energy comes through this medium. What medium is used for the sunlight to reach us? Well, without going into the history of ether and all that, scientists thought that there must be something, but it turns out light can be radiated through space. It doesn't need a medium. Now, that's such a common observation that everybody takes it for granted, but I find it rather remarkable. Rather remarkable. Like God designed this system in order to be able to transmit energy through space from the sun to the earth without having wires and stuff up there. That's kind of cool, I think. Anyway, Another thing, you all know the story of Goldilocks? Goldilocks and the three bears, yeah? You remember that Papa Bear's porridge was too hot, Mama Bear's porridge was too cold, and Baby Bear's porridge was just right, okay? And likewise the chair and the bed and so on was just right. And that story has lent its name to what's called the Goldilocks principle. In the design of our world, the sunlight is not too much and it's not too little. It's just right. The temperature is not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. The amount of water, so many features of the earth are just right that scientists have even borrowed the term the Goldilocks principle to describe the fitness of our earth for life. It really does look designed. So I don't know that we could talk about the wavelength of sunlight and how it is appropriate and so on. Well, I shouldn't have said that. Now I have to say something more about it. The amount of energy the main part of energy from the sun, it has the amount of the energy that comes from the sunlight is just the right amount to trigger chemical reactions in plants that generate food through the process of photosynthesis. If it were weaker, we'd all starve from lack of food. If it was stronger, we could all fry from ultraviolet radiation. But it comes in just right. Now, the atmosphere. The atmosphere is also just right. What do we need in our atmosphere in order for life to exist? Oxygen, okay? How much oxygen do we need? Would it be better if the whole atmosphere was pure oxygen? Why? Well, a couple of reasons. One is if a fire ever got started, it would never go out. But not only that, oxygen is toxic to human beings in concentration. I had a nephew who was born prematurely. He was given oxygen because of his premature birth. He was given too much oxygen. I don't know whether the prematurity also added to this problems, but he developed blindness. He was mute, deaf. Well, I don't know if he was actually mute. He may have made noises, but he was deaf and blind. And he died something like 7 or 8 years of age. It was a real tragedy. But at least part of the reason was he was given too much oxygen. If you have too much oxygen, it'll kill you. So that means if we're going to have oxygen on our world, we have to dilute it with something. What should we dilute it with? How about hydrogen sulfide? You know what hydrogen sulfide is? It's the smell of rotten eggs, and it is terribly toxic. You know, it could be done. The planet could have had oxygen and hydrogen sulfide as an atmosphere, but it doesn't. Why nitrogen? Nitrogen is what God chose to dilute the oxygen. It's a very clever choice. Because nitrogen is fairly inert, we can breathe it in and breathe it out. It doesn't affect our bodies. That's good. But more than that, nitrogen is a part of proteins. You can't have proteins without having nitrogen. So God made microbes and plants, microbes that can take nitrogen and move it in chemical reactions and part of the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen has a dual function. It dilutes the oxygen and it provides the nutrients for us. It allows us to get protein. That's a tremendously clever, I think, way of doing it. So and toxic gases are rare, all right? Now, water, we have all heard so much about water, I don't know if we need to say much about it, but you've heard of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Scientists are looking to see if there's life on some other planets. So far, I've never heard about any trucks or skyscrapers. They don't find those. In fact, I don't even think they're looking for them. What are they looking for? They're looking for water. If there's no water, if there's no evidence of water on a planet, I think most scientists would say, let's look for another planet. It's not worth worrying about that planet unless there's water on it, because water is so vital for life. Water is an excellent solvent. It's a moderator of temperature. There's a whole book on design of water molecule. A whole book just recently published in the last couple of years, something like that, from the Discovery Institute up in Seattle, I think. All right, so we've seen that the light, atmosphere, and water all have actually special properties. Next time you read Genesis 1, I hope you'll never read it the same again. God said, let there be light, and you think to yourself, wow, he made light so that it can do this and this. Let there be a firmament to separate the waters above from the waters below. Wow, that's the atmosphere. It's designed. Let the water be separated from the dry land. Wow, there's design in that water. Yeah, all the way through. Fantastic design. So now, if you don't believe in God, if you say, no, there's no God, it had to be just by natural processes, what do you need? You have to say, the size and distance of the sun and moon are just lucky. The size of the earth and the speed of its rotation is just lucky. Suitable energy output of the sun is just lucky. Suitable atmosphere composition is just luck. Recently, I learned of a man who won the lottery. And a year or two previously, he had won the lottery another time. I said, that's interesting. Then I learned that another year, his wife had won the lottery. Wow. Let's suppose that he wins the lottery again, and then again, and then again. That's pretty good luck, don't you think? Or what would you think? Would you wonder if he has connections somewhere to the lottery? Yeah. You would say, wait a minute. Although you can write a fraction to represent the probability of this, that fraction is so small that I don't believe it can happen by chance. And I don't think any of us would believe that somebody could win the lottery 4 or 5 times in a row without cheating. In the context here, I don't think you could get all those things coming out together in one place without intelligence being involved. Intelligent design, if you please. Our earth is marvelously made. So, life requires very specific combinations of environmental conditions. No other planet is known to be able to support intelligent life. The remarkable fitness of our environment for life looks like design rather than chance. Remember last night we talked about science and proof. Have we proved creation? No. We have not proved creation. We cannot use science to prove creation. We can use Genesis if we accept Scripture. We cannot use science to prove creation. But does it seem eminently reasonable to think that there's a creator? Absolutely. The evidence just fits that picture so well, it's hard to imagine any other explanation. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. So here's our conclusions. The big patterns, remember we started by saying we want to look at the big patterns, and there isn't any pattern that's bigger than the universe. other than God himself, but any pattern in nature. The big patterns point to creation, the universe in its origin, order, and structure, the earth and its light, heat, atmosphere, and water, and many other things could be added. The creation shows clear evidence of divine activity, and the philosophy of materialism just seems to me untenable. In fact, I have this suspicion about atheists. An atheist is someone who says, there is no God, and I hate him. Right? That's what I think an atheist is, because I think most atheists have somehow gotten angry with God, perhaps even in the proxy of you and I or other Christians, offended by Christians and say, if that's the way God is, I want nothing to do with him. In fact, I heard one say that once. I was raised in a Baptist home and I don't need God. Almost in that kind of tone of voice. You say, well, this is not a man who's just looking at the evidence objectively with a neutral, open heart. No, this is a man who's hurting. He's had experience in the past that has hurt him and shut off his pathway to God. And we don't know enough about everything. I talked last night. We don't know everything. We are not going to know everything. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. All of us are going to say that sooner or later. Some of us say it more often than people want us to sometimes, especially when talking about faith issues. I find many people are not satisfied with a I don't know answer. I want to know. Well, what is it when you believe something without demonstration? Faith, isn't it? Faith is part of our human existence. We can expect to have the need for faith. That's part of our nature, that faith is necessary. And I'll make this claim. No theory of origins explains everything. And I would include our own understanding of creation. I can't explain everything, and I've never met anybody who could. But I would say no other theory of origins is better than creation. All theories have their weaknesses and there's challenges and so on. I think biblical creation does as good a job as anybody. I don't feel bad about it. Nature points to a supernatural designer. Remember that third point up there. What does it say? What's the best answer to our questions? The life and teachings of Jesus Christ. That's where we can find, if we have questions about God, look to see what Jesus showed us in his life and teachings. And compare what he showed us with what Darwin tells us. And you will see a tremendous contrast. Jesus favored the weak, not looking for ways to eliminate them. And so on down the line. Yes, Jesus has the life and teachings of Jesus are the place to look for our answers. The psalmist again started with him. Heavens declare the glory of God. Now we will end with him. In wisdom you have made them all. You can see God's wisdom in the things he has made.